Her name was Clara, and she had lived in the same small London flat for over 30 years. She was 57, slightly stooped from years of carrying groceries, laundry baskets, and the invisible weight of being the person everyone depended on. Every morning, she woke up at 6 a.m. Not because she liked mornings, but because the apartment was quieter then. The city outside hummed softly through the cracked window pane, and the sounds of early traffic reminded her the world was already moving, even if she often felt stuck. Her husband, Simon, had retired last year. He spent most of his mornings in the living room reading the newspaper, hardly speaking, occasionally nodding when she passed him tea. They shared a home but rarely shared thoughts anymore. Conversations had become functional. Questions about bills, reminders for appointments, or logistics about the household. Her daughter, Emma, was 29, working in a fast-paced London marketing firm. She called sometimes, mostly when she needed advice or reminders about appointments. Her son, Luke, lived in Manchester. He visited only on holidays and weekends, carrying his life packed in 2 suitcases, focused on his job and friends, leaving little space for her presence in his life. Clara's life had become a rhythm of silence and service. She cooked breakfast, cleaned the apartment, washed clothes, ran errands, all with precision, all quietly. She had grown used to the invisible labor that sustained the household, the kind no one thanked her for because they assumed it would always be done. One Wednesday morning, Clara woke up with a dull ache in her back. Nothing serious, just enough to slow her down. She tried to ignore it, thinking, it will pass. But as she brewed her tea, she noticed the quiet for the first time. The silence wasn't comforting, it was heavy. She poured herself a cup, sat by the window, and looked at the city streets below. People were walking fast, carrying coffee, pushing strollers, rushing to meetings. She had spent decades moving for others, and yet she realized she had hardly moved for herself. That day, Clara did something she hadn't done in years. She didn't immediately start chores. She let the dishes sit in the sink. She ignored the laundry basket. She put on her coat and left the apartment. Walking through her neighborhood, she felt awkward at first. People passed her, nodding politely, but she wasn't used to being alone without a task. She wandered into a small park nearby, the one she used to visit with her children when they were young. The pond was still there. Ducks floated lazily, ripples spreading across the water. She watched a young mother juggling a toddler and a cup of coffee and smiled quietly. Sitting on a bench, she opened a notebook she had bought months ago but never used. She wrote about mundane things at first, the weather, the smell of wet grass, the sound of distant traffic, but slowly, her thoughts turned inward. She wrote about being invisible, about always giving to others and forgetting herself, about the ache of quiet loneliness even when surrounded by family. Hours passed. She didn't notice. She didn't care. For the first time in decades, she experienced what it meant to be fully present for herself. When she returned home, the flat was the same. Simon was reading in the living room, Emma's old drawings still pinned to the fridge, dishes waiting in the sink. Nothing had changed externally. But Clara had changed. The next morning, she still woke early. But she made tea differently. She poured herself 1 cup, sat at the kitchen table, and lingered in its warmth before anyone else stirred. When Simon asked, "Why so slow?" she simply said, "Just enjoying it." Days turned into weeks. Clara began taking small walks, visiting the market, sitting in cafes alone, sometimes writing, sometimes just watching life happen around her. She didn't tell anyone why. She didn't need to. She was reclaiming herself quietly, piece by piece. Her children noticed small changes. Emma called more often, asking how she spent her day. Luke sent texts that didn't feel rushed. Her husband, at first puzzled, began to ask her opinions, started small conversations. Clara realized something important. The world doesn't stop if a woman chooses herself for a change. The house doesn't collapse. People adapt. And quietly, silently, she began to live again, not for anyone else, not for expectations, but for her own sense of existence. She would always care for her family. But she also learned that it was okay to care for herself. That was the lesson that had taken decades to sink in. And in the evenings, when she sat by her window with her notebook and a fresh cup of tea, Clara finally felt a lightness she hadn't known since she was a young girl. The weight of invisible labor lifted, replaced by quiet, steady presence in her own life.